Hello, and welcome to another edition of Your Therapist Needs Therapy, the podcast where mental health professionals talk about their mental health journeys and how they navigate mental wellness while working in the mental health field. I'm your host, Jeremy Schumacher, licensed marriage and family therapist. We have a special guest episode, a non-therapist episode, one that I'm super stoked about in sort of a, I think, niche way where maybe other people aren't, because we're going to talk about Nazis today. But I am joined by researcher extraordinaire Spencer Sunshine. His book, Neo-Nazi Terrorism and Countercultural Fascism, came out last year. And I have read it over the past couple of weeks and reread aspects of it. And Spencer was kind enough to take some time to join me today to talk about neo-Nazis and James Mason's siege and all the little facets that led to some of the alt-right we know today.
Well, thank you for having me on the show. I mean, I think it's really great to I'm usually on a lot of anti-fascist niche political things. So I'm really happy to be talking to different kinds of people, and that different kinds of people are interested in my work.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I'm going to jump to the end of the book, but you have some recommendations at the end of your book just on how to cover topics like these. And one of the things you write is to not just dismiss some of the alt-right and some of the new neo-Nazi stuff as mental health issues. And I thought that was really interesting because I think that is sort of America's go-to, where we don't really want to dig into this stuff too deeply. So few bad apples or mental health is this Band-Aid that gets slapped on a lot of issues.
Yeah. I think, in this kind of crystallized to me in the pre-Trump 1 era, because I've been doing this work for about 20 years. I work closely with a guy named Chip Berlet, who had written extensive, one of the few people in the U.S. who wrote extensively about the far right between the 70s and I think he retired around 2020. And one of the things he emphasized was that we need to, especially in this period, a lot of people who wrote about the far right when they did, academics and such, were just these just fringe people. They're the mental health issues. This isn't almost a movement. It's almost a psychotic reaction to something, right? That someone's yelling about Jews or something. And Chip always said, look, you can't, this is a wrong-headed way to approach this stuff. This is a political movement. People are it functions like any other political movement. There's reformist and radical wings. People have their reasons for joining. It creates the same reasons you might join the left, you might join the right? Creates senses of community, gives people a framework to understand the world. There are motive pulls, just like there are on the left and right. There's, various things in your background that it's appealing to, or opportunities that it offers you. And you can't look at people on the far right, at neo-Nazis, even at terrorists, as if they're just it's just some kind of a bunch of people with serious mental health concerns that have somehow had a label slapped on top of them, right? And it's almost not a political movement. It's people were approaching it that way. He was you have to approach it the way you would approach any other political movement. Is it a super toxic one? Yes. The idea that we couldn't create a political movement whose goal is murdering millions of people is absurd, because there are all kinds of political movements that have done that,
right.
in the world. Yeah. So there was a real, I think that was definitely one of the things I do emphasize in the book, is that I'm a person on the left, and the work I do about the right comes out of my own politics on the left. And that in writing the book, I looked at a lot of this stuff, how I would see how the left itself is constructed, how people think about things, its relationship with cultural movements like the counterculture, and be well, a lot of these same dynamics are at play here, even though these people are neo-Nazis and have a very different set of values and visions that they want to enact. But it too is people there have the same, desires and hopes and dynamics that everybody, as Marx said, nothing human is alien to me, right? It's right. It's at the end of the day, in a strange way, it is the same damn shit.
Yeah. Well, and I'm coming from a religious trauma perspective. And one of the things that sort of cracked me up in reading the book was the love of acronyms. I mean, that neo-Nazi movement through the 60s and 70s, you have a chart early in the book laying out all the different acronyms they use. And growing up religious, that's all these little different religious sects. And it's very similar how these splits happen, these schisms happen, and now we have all these new labels in what you mentioned earlier, people looking for community. And as the book progresses, you tie in the countercultural piece where people were in punk rock and people who were in heavy metal and people who were in the occultist background were drawn to this, not because they were Nazis, but because they found community in it.
Yeah, I mean, you see these same dynamics. I actually wrote the book. The first half, as you mentioned, is about the schisming of these neo-Nazi political groups, and I've read many histories of Trotskyist groups and all of their schisms. And I was like, oh, at least for this period of neo-Nazis, you can approach it the same way in the same framework. Like, let's talk about there's a parent group. There are all these splinters off of it. They divide over personalities, but over ideology. Same way all of these, religious groups do. Often have keep very similar names. They all claim that they're the true, original path from the original, parent group. The parent group has lost its way. They have like the true claim to the original strain and tradition, and then they go off and they do their own thing. Yeah, a lot of very similar dynamics going on there. So
was the impetus to sort of write this book knowing James Mason was this like through line from the 60s till the current day, or was that sort of became a vehicle to tell the whole cohesive story? Because I think he is an interesting figure in all the connections he has.
It is. Should we talk about who James Mason is?
Yeah, let's back up because most of my audience is mental health professionals.
Yeah,
so for those
always keep up on the minutia of the neo-Nazi movement.
For those of you who don't know, James Mason was a neo-Nazi. Spencer, you should probably do this because you wrote the book, and
Sure.
Mine's going to be a gross summary of oversimplification of all the work you put in.
So a lot of people don't think about this, but let me say first. So people talk about the far right and they kind of think one thing, or then sometimes we say white supremacists. Hey, not Donald Trump, but like true organized white supremacists. Okay. And then we go, okay, well, there's neo-Nazis and they're not necessarily like other white supremacists, right? The Klan aren't neo-Nazis. And then people are like, okay, I'm following you. All right, I get that. Then you have to look at neo-Nazis. They too have more moderate and more extreme factions, right? And so if the far right is on the right side of the political spectrum and the white supremacists are on the right side of that and the neo-Nazis are on the right side of that, this is the wall. People like James Mason are the very wall. He is a terrorist ideologue. He advocates that people engage in random acts of terrorism that are done very publicly with a lot of panache in hopes of creating so much chaos that neo-Nazis can destabilize the government and society as a whole. He advocates doing this through assassinations, through serial killings, through bombings, through mass racial unrest. Like he's, a pedophile and like advocates pedophilia. Nothing is like off the table for this. He was friends with many neo-Nazis who were murderers. One guy who was a famous serial killer. And so he developed his ideology, as we were talking about these little splinter groups. When he was a teenager, he joined a group called the American Nazi Party. They're the first open neo-Nazi party in the United States. He joined them
at 14. He was young.
Yeah, it was in 1966 he joined. He was 14 years old. And that party splintered. In the 60s and 70s into a bunch of different groups. The party still continued on. All these other groups said, oh, we're continuing the original, like the leader's vision. He had died in 1967. George Lincoln Rockwell, older listeners will know who he is. And so every group is like, oh no, we're following we're the true Nazis, yada, yada, yada. And they got in fights with each other. They splintered, they tried to fuse. You may guess how this thing's gonna look. Mason went through this whole process and in the end, in the 80s, decided that there was no legal work that a neo-Nazi could do that would be effective. They couldn't hold public rallies. They couldn't create membership-based groups. They couldn't do grassroots organizing. They tried these things. And basically, nobody wanted a neo-Nazi group around. He decided quite accurately that there was no force in society that was going to allow a explicitly neo-Nazi party come to power, right? Like even Donald Trump, what use does he have for a swastika-waving Nazi party? It's counterproductive to him. So Mason came up with this idea, and he's moving through these groups that get smaller and smaller. And I like to say he ends up as a party of one, cranking this newsletter. He writes himself. He mimeographs himself in the 80s called Siege, never makes more than 100 copies. And here he develops the philosophy that since you can't do any traditional political work, you should just do a terrorism. and he starts advocating these things. And his friends at the time, or people he knows, start to go murder from the neo-Nazi movement. That there starts to be a wave of murders by them. I learned in doing this book that the first neo-Nazi mass murder in the United States didn't happen until 1977.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like today, we're like, oh yeah, some guy went to the mall or killed his family. So that movement had actually existed in the US for a number of decades before this sort of thing that we see now happening. So this stuff started to happen with neo-Nazis, and he was like, oh, hey, like, I know some of these people, we can use this violence and weave it into a new political philosophy. He's totally obscure. Even the other neo-Nazis can't stand him. He befriends Charles Manson and says that Manson should be the new neo-Nazi guru after Adolf Hitler. This alienates his comrades, but it does attract people from the 80s counterculture. Not everyone's familiar with the minutia of what happened in the 80s and the counterculture, but in the 70s, when the punk scene happened, a lot of other kind of countercultural currents came out of or coalesced around it that are not, punk rock. Some of them people are familiar with, like the goth scene, for example, which is having a revival, and new wave and like dark wave, and like, it goes along with like ska and parallel to skinheads and stuff. But along with this stuff is a scene emerges in the 80s that we called at the time the extreme culture scene. And it was like a sort of branch off of this. The people are a little older than people involved in punk rock. So people were like artists and, musicians, filmmakers, people like in their mid-20s generally, I think, at that point in the 80s. And they really just wanted to dig into the extremities of society and just wallow in them. It's often been compared to being a Gnostic, or often seen, and some of these guys explicitly did see themselves as engaged in a Gnostic process of attempting to just like go to the wall so hard, just to admire, dive into the most toxic stuff in an attempt to like sort of puncture some sort of like fake reality that the world is in and gain something else. And so these people are, interested in cult leaders and like serial killers again, Nazis, child murderers and pedophiles, all this stuff. And so a few guys from the scene, some of whom became well known later, a musician, Boyd Rice, another musician and publisher named Michael Moynihan. So Rice was an industrial musician. Michael Moynihan, who was younger than the rest, was an industrial musician who became a neo-folk musician. Nicholas Schreck, who's a Satanist, who was also a musician in a gothy band called Radio Werewolf, and a publisher named Adam Parfrey, who founded a well-known press called Feral House that sold hundreds of thousands of books, and several of the books have been made into movies. Formed a group, found James Mason, were like, oh wow, there's this neo-Nazi who's friends with Charles Manson. It was this crazy philosophy that like is very much in tune with what we're doing. Find him, befriend him. They convince him, rightly or wrongly, that they're all on board politically. And then they spend about 9 years collectively like figuring out how to sell James Mason to the 80s and 90s counterculture. And they start putting him in their magazines and putting him in their books and putting him in documentaries. And this culminates with one of the guys, Michael Moynihan, editing the newsletters that James Mason had published in the 80s called Siege into a book, and then publishing the book himself. And so the important part, this is a long story. We put the really important part last, is that this book was fairly obscure until about 2015. And that's when a new wave of a neo-Nazi, the current wave of global neo-Nazi terrorism coalesces around a website called Iron March. A group called, the best known group that comes out of this is called the Atomwaffen Division in the US. There, 5 people were killed by members and affiliates of the group. But now there's a whole bunch of different groups, and this has become a whole incredibly worrisome global phenomena with dozens of murders. They discover, the people at the core of the center of this revival, when it's still small, discover the book Siege by James Mason, and they start promoting it as their main ideological text. So with Atomwaffen Division, everyone had to read the book. There was apparently, a former member said there was a test you had to take on the book to get into the group. So intellectuals like to be like, oh, this book is driving all of this thing, and this, because intellectuals love books. But in this case, it really is an unusual case where it really seems rather directly and unambiguously like that this was what was going on. These guys found James Mason. They made contact with them. He mentors them. There's pictures of like people in his apartment with him before they go and commit a murder. This is a guy, Samuel Woodward, who just received life in prison. Here's a picture of him. He was an Atomwaffen member who killed Blaise Bernstein, a gay Jewish man in Southern California. There's a picture of Woodward, the perpetrator, with Mason in his apartment. And so the ideas presented here are important because now there's this global network. Atomwaffen ended up spinning off or inspiring a whole bunch of other groups. Now this network has morphed into a series of shifting Telegram channels, dubbed Terragram, of people who are, again, trying to inspire their followers to commit these dramatic acts of violence and terrorism. And they're starting to fuse with online child abuse cults like 764, with the Nazi Satanist current of the Order of Nine Angles, and with new nihilistic groups that they say they're Nazis and Satanists, but they're really pretty explicitly just trying to get people to commit random violence, like the Maniac Murder Cult. And so neo-Nazi terrorism is bad enough. Now we have this stuff, helping cross-pollinate in a pool of like a global networks of child molesters, Nazi Satanists, and terrorists. And it's like a real fucking thing. So I was very interested in this in the story as I started to discover it. So the first half of the book is about these different neo-Nazi splinter groups. I'm very interested in like structured political groups, like around ideologically driven structured political groups, and what happens with some of it just for its own sake. Let's just be honest. It's my version of bug collecting, to track each sectology, we call it, each little splinter group, and why and who and when. And then the other half is about this countercultural scene, because I was around this scene. I've seen some of these people perform. I have mutual friends with these people, the four people I was talking about. And like, we always knew that there were neo-Nazis in the scene, and these people had always been accused of some level of sympathy or adherence, what their relationship to these neo-Nazis were, because there was some evidence, but these figures always denied there was anything really real there. And so I found all this material in an archive of James Mason's letters and could reconstruct this whole story.
Yeah. Which is at Kansas State, one of...
It's at University of Kansas in Lawrence, yeah.
Yeah. And I think he's a figure that I think most people wouldn't know. Like, if I bring up Order of Nine Angles, most people don't know what I'm talking about. Atomwaffen is more well known, but like Rapewaffen and Order of Nine Angles, like those are obscure. But again, like, I'm in religious trauma, so these weird religious sects that are covers for pedophilia in a lot of cases, like, that's interesting versus the mainstream where like, hey, we know, I'm going to throw some shade at the Catholic Church here, but like, we know the new Pope has gone out of his way to defend priests who raped children. So you have sort of the like mainstream version and then this countercultural version, and those attract very different groups. But James Mason was one of these through lines of like, he had his own theories, but he connected with a lot of groups that weren't necessarily aligned. It was a lot of people using each other for mutual benefit.
It's hard to tell what was going on and who was using who, but he was definitely connected to such a large series of different things. Like, I love being on your podcast. I've had all different kinds of people have me on their podcast or reach out to me. Some of the people interested, some people like are really interested in it. Like, I've had people, for example, who do global terrorism, counter-terrorism work. Like, they don't care about Nazis. They just care about terrorists, whoever they are, right? Some of whom are like in the global security services, and other people who are like, I don't care about the political stuff, but like, I'm not a Nazi and I'm into like industrial music, and we wanted to know who the Nazis were. And, I don't care about these other, all the splinter groups, or, we just like, was Adam Parfrey a Nazi or wasn't he? Right. So it was interesting how many different kinds of Charles Manson acolytes and like people into Satanists. The Satanists are very interested in some of the work that I've done here, because I talk about the reality of Nazis in their scene, because there's so much when you're inside a religious movement, especially a very like gossipy rumor, backbiting one. It's hard to figure out what information is good or not, right? There's a lot of info out there, and like what's made up and what's like mythical and yada yada yada. So they're interested in this because Mason somehow got involved in the Church of Satan as well. Yes, it's interesting. And then the people he influenced touched so many people too. People in the metal scene as well. We can talk about. Did you read the chapter on Varg? The little piece about Varg at the end?
Yeah, in one of the appendices.
So he's influencing this wild neo-Nazi espousing terrorism and worshiping Charles Manson is influencing pop culture too. Like their albums with his influence, like Electric Hellfire Club and such, is clearly visible.
Yeah. Well, and like Anton LaVey and his daughter, his daughter was dating or married to Shrek for a while. So like,
decades. Yeah. Xena and Shrek got married. Yeah.
So there are all these, like for my piece, again, I grew up deeply Christian and like wouldn't have been exposed to a lot of this stuff, but definitely remember the Satanic Panic. I was old enough to catch the tail end of it in the 80s and then the Harry Potter scare in the 90s. Because Christians like to recycle their fear mongering. But it was sort of this, those were on all the daytime talk shows, like getting a Satanist on. And so you have these sort of fringe, but like closer to mainstream figures who would be interviewed on stuff like this. And I think it's really fascinating to think like, yeah, pre-internet, James Mason was sending out things by mail to however many subscribers he had, not that many. But then you get put on something like a daytime talk show and suddenly you have all this much wider reach, smaller still than the internet, but like that's how some of this stuff limped on through different decades of new people finding it.
Yeah, for something so just incredibly niche, you can definitely see these points where it got mainstream popularity. So about like the Satanic Panic, Geraldo Rivera had this 2-hour special that was supposedly the best watched special of its kind at the time about Satanism in 1988. And these 4 people I talked about, it wasn't Moynihan, it was Xena LaVey, Anton LaVey's daughter, the founder of the Church of Satan, Adam Parfrey, Boyd Rice, and Nicholas Schreck, did a performance that was taped by Geraldo's people and is visible on the show. They run a segment of it on this best watched, probably the best watched televised event about the Satanic Panic, right? And you can see this stuff directly. I actually found a snippet of a major white supremacist leader from the 80s and 90s, Tom Metzger, was on the McLaughlin show, one of these like hour-long, proper talk shows that they still used to have. And at one point, he's waving a copy of Siege on national TV. I mean, this is being watched again by probably millions of people. And so you're like, oh, this guy's like making a newsletter with 100 copies. But like even in the 80s, you're seeing flashes of it able to get like in front of huge audiences, right? It's affecting the pop culture, affecting the discourse, even in little sparks, before those things eventually catch like fire later on.
Yeah. And being a millennial, but also, deeply shrouded in Christianity. And so not getting to listen to anything other than Jesus music for much of my life, Jesus music and country for some reason. But like, I remember when by the time I found punk music, it was somewhat known to be anti-Nazi, like Nazi punks fuck off was like one of the first songs I probably was exposed to. And so like looking back at the history of like, oh, there was this, anti-fascist movement within the punk scene, but then there's this also like very fascist friendly movement within the punk scene and the skinhead scene then that the neo-Nazis of the 90s jumped on as well.
Well, one thing that I had this discussion with someone the other day, it's good to point out, if they're within a specific like corner of something is a anti-fascist, openly, vocally anti-fascist element, it's because there are fascists there. And so sometimes we know there's a problem that's not visible because we can see that there are public anti-fascists, right? That's the visible, because they'll be visible. We found this out in the vegan scene in the 2010s, because we started seeing in Britain vegan anti-fascists, and we're like, okay, well, we know there's a problem here, or you wouldn't be here, and you wouldn't be here so loud. So
yeah. And I think with the metal scene too, I mean, as a latecomer to metal, I'm always Googling, like, just double checking, making sure this band I like isn't actually racist.
Absolutely. And that is a 100% requirement at this point, especially if it's a black metal band.
Yeah. And some of the like Viking metal, Scandinavian metal, like, I don't know what they're singing. I don't speak some of those languages. And so some of that imagery is real dicey. And I think that's where, you get into in the book where some of the publicists, like Parfrey especially, and Moynihan to a lesser degree, he seemed more open with it. But like, we're sort of like double dealing on that, like, dog whistling some of this stuff, but then denying it because they needed to sell books or maintain some mainstream access.
Yeah, there was a lot of double dealing there, and I mean, I won't go so far as to say this is directly how this irony soaked, fake Nazi, real Nazi thing developed, but they were explicitly doing the same technique in the 80s and 90s. One person called it winky wink fascism, where they're like, present themselves as a fascist, then say, oh, I'm not, and then kind of like, but they really are, or really are in touch, or really are collaborating.
Yep.
So it's like, I'm not a fascist, wink. And
Yeah.
it's a technique you see a lot now, like, oh, it's just irony, oh, it's just a joke. And you're like, maybe it is, and maybe it's not. Maybe you don't even know anymore. I mean, that's what I got with some of these people, because they end up working with neo-Nazis, multiple ones, they're collaborating with them, they're helping them. And you're like, maybe they thought at first it was just a wild thing or a joke or something, but like at some point you're like, even if they did, which I'm not saying they did, I think they've lost the plot about where they are in this. And like, aside from the question of it, my take in the book is that it doesn't matter. This is something of a difference with people who often come from a more therapy or psychology background, is that in my book, I track these statements people make and the actions they do and the networks they form. And I don't talk about their intentions. Not that there's, not that one shouldn't talk about intentions per se, but we get lost in the talking about intentions instead of seeing like, what did this person actually do that they are accountable for? How did they do it? Because otherwise people get lost in this question of, and we can never know the answer to what someone's subjectivity is, especially if they're liars. And the people I dealt with, they were all liars, very consciously. They consciously used these manipulative strategies. They ran campaigns of disinformation after their period of interaction with Masons to separate themselves. They would, smear their opponents. Someone pointed out they used Darvo, which I had never heard of before. The deny, attack, reverse victim, and offender. And then once I learned about that, I was like, oh, holy shit! You see it everywhere, then, right?
Yeah, the church loves to do that.
It was interesting for me personally. After I read about that, I'm like, let me make sure if someone criticizes me for something that I also don't do that, right? Let me make sure that my answer is not. Even if I feel like I'm being falsely accused, even if I am, that my answer does not fall on down those lines. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Well, and some of what you talk about in the book is just like evidence-based, because Mason kept so many of his correspondences to say, this is the date where this person started putting swastikas in their letters. And like at some point, well, at least it wasn't a deal breaker for them. It wasn't a bother to them to keep interacting with this person in this way.
Well, they were writing, like the people like Boyd Rice were putting swastikas on their letters to Mason. It's not just that Mason was doing it to that. Like, and so they had clearly, all of them to some extent or another gone down the rabbit hole, at least for a period of time. It was pretty wild stuff to see. I mean, one of the guys, Adam Parfrey, who I mentioned, I have he passed away while I was writing the book, but many, many mutual friends with him, because I worked in sort of underground publishing for years. Like I had, I was introduced to this woman who was a mutual friend of some of my other friends, and she was like, "Oh, I knew Adam. I published a couple books on Feral House. I used to be his cat sitter." And I was like, she's this nice, cute Jewish woman who wrote a couple quirky books about zines and conspiracy theories in the 90s when this stuff just seemed wacky. And I was like, you're a nice person and smart, and you have an understanding of anti-Semitism in particular, because these are, of course, neo-Nazis, and there's anti-Semitism undergirds this whole thing. And I'm like, why were you working with this guy? Like, and she was like, no, he's really nice to me. I'm very interested in your book though. And, I want to read it. She read it as soon as it came out, and she came back and she's like, in a dejected way, was like, he was using me, wasn't he? Like, I was the like nice, quirky Jewish woman on the front. So he could go, be, promoting and writing and helping out white supremacists and neo-Nazis while pretending he wasn't, or pretending he was just doing it because they were extremes and he was really making fun of or exposing these people, while in reality he clearly was a sympathizer and collaborator, if not a member.
Well, and I think there's a lot of that in the book for sure, but also just the different groups. Like David Duke shows up here and there in the book, and some of the other figures of like Satanist movements show up here and there. They're not avowed neo-Nazis. They're not necessarily aligned with the tenets of National Socialism, but like, hey, this is going to get a wider audience, or this is going to maybe bring some new converts over. And a lot of people were pretty comfortable moving their morals around for some mutual benefit.
there were a lot of people, yes, who I think in the 80s and 90s, there was a real sheen to this stuff. And you really get to see where people who want to be edgy, and there's nothing wrong with being edgy. There's nothing wrong with I don't advise it, but if you really want to just like dive face first into the most extreme things and just bathe yourself in it in some form of self-abnegation, you know, like this isn't a healthy way to do things, but like fine, politically, it doesn't need to be a reactionary thing. And to see where people like didn't have the cutoff switch, and you know, with that like they didn't just want to be extreme, they wanted to like go past that into something like that was harmful to other people, but not to them. For example, I mean, Boyd Rice at some point is like, oh, there's 100 more things that, you know, I have to worry about other than the neo-Nazis in the US. And I'm like, well, yeah, they're your friends. Like, they're not going to bother you. Like, what are you're really telling on yourself with this passage, right? So you can really see who, at the end of the day, what is it people always claim? Oh, I hate everybody, you know, when a comedian or something says this. And you're like, okay, but do you? Like, let's see. Right? Like, go count, you know, and then people are like, oh, I just like extremes. But it's like the neo-Nazis you're friends with, not like, I don't know, you know, old Marxist-Leninist terrorists, right?
Right. Yeah.
Who are you writing in prison? Are you writing Weather Underground, or are you writing National Socialist Liberation Front?
Yeah. I was very surprised, I will say, personally, reading the book, how little the Aryan Brotherhood showed up. Like, there's a small amount of prison letter writing that gets mentioned, but like my understanding of like Nazis in modern America was like, yeah, the Aryan Brotherhood is the big bad, and most of them are in prison, but they've got their groups selling drugs outside too. And like, wasn't a lot of overlap in the, at least in Mason's lineage.
Mason doesn't like AB. So basically, I was really interested in the prison angle. I think you may be the only interviewer who has brought that up. The Brotherhood and other prison gangs like it tend not to be political at all, really. Like, I think Penn 1 is maybe a little bit around the edges. These are racial separatist gangs, you know, in the prisons, sometimes with outside elements that are involved in drugs, who kill a lot of people, but generally their own members who fuck them up. They generally do not get involved in politics. And the political groups don't necessarily want to be around them either. I mean, these people, you know, a guy in jail for an apolitical crime with a swastika tattoo is not a political activist.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, it is very unusual for people in AB or the other Nazi prison gangs to have any kind of high level of interface with political groups. You know, they get out and they go into the dealing of these groups, you know, whatever criminal activities on the outside. They're not going and then like running a web page or writing art. You know, they're not doing the boring work of being in a political movement. So there actually isn't. There's actually more AB stuff there than I learned more about them than I had known. The main thing is that they, and this I didn't know, had an alliance with Charles Manson in the early 70s after he originally went to jail. And there was a split where his AB contact tried to take all or part of the family over. And ended up, him and his people ended up getting married, I think, to a couple of Manson family girls, who they murdered people in joint with. There was like a joint Brotherhood family murder spree while, you know, after the 69 Tate LaBianca murders, while Charles Manson was in prison. It's a strange, there is some level of connection, but I don't think that Mason liked the Aryan Brotherhood. But in general, the Aryan Brotherhood and these other Nazi prison gangs are pretty far away from the political neo-Nazis, strange as that may seem, in this very rarefied, very small world of American National Socialism.
Yeah, well, and it's, you know, I think maybe on HBO Max, there's a Aryan Brotherhood documentary that came out not that long ago. And I was, what stood out to me right away was like the hypocrisy of like, they work regularly with the cartel to sell drugs. And I think that was something in reading the book where like the AB wasn't there, but I think some of those like loose, hey, we don't believe the same things, but if we can work towards the same end, or if money is on the line, then I'm okay turning something up or turning down just to work with you. And I think I see that a lot, again, from like the cult perspective of like they're very rigid rules for in-group people, but the leaders of the group can sort of play fast and loose with those things if the ends justify working together.
They're not the Brotherhood. I mean, one of their founders is partly Jewish, is a Jewish family background. Like they're not,
which isn't unusual.
Yeah, I mean, it's not. Or gay or a person of color. I mean, this stuff is far more common than people think. I once met a black Nazi who was trying to infiltrate a group I was around. Yeah, it was pretty weird. He ended up being like out, he was an actual legit full National Socialist. So we found out. Yeah, there's all kinds of weird people in that. But the Brotherhood is never a political group. I think that's the hard thing for people. I mean, it was founded as a kind of, I think these groups were founded as sort of as the prisons became hyper racially segregated in the 60s, like there had to be a white group within the violence. And there were different Nazi, white supremacist prison gangs founded around that time. I think some of them like took this symbolism first just to represent that they were white. Like it's just, it wasn't like necessarily white supremacists, it was like a symbol of being white versus Chicano or black or, at the time. And then it morphed into something a little more serious.
Yeah. And Mason spent time in prison. That's where he wrote that's where he formalized sort of his thought process on what he was going to publish later.
He did. And at one point he says, because sometimes he plays with being a racial separatist, that he says specifically that like racial separatism in a society should exist like it works like it does in prison, where everyone's in the prison together, but they're separate, and they have some level of interaction, but very minimal. But that like is a working basis for racial separatism is the prisons, which is kind of an interesting argument.
Yeah. This is a hard turn topic wise, but I'm curious from a psychology perspective. We know over the stage of life development, a lot of that edginess hits in the teenage years as we're going through the process of individuation, trying to figure out who we are as a person, where sort of the difference from our family of origin to the person we're going to be as an adult exists. Did you see any sort of people coming and going in these groups based on like, hey, I'm interested in the edginess of it, and then I grew up and stopped being interested in the edginess of it?
Yeah, Mason, I often, like we mentioned, joined the American Nazi Party when he was 14. He committed all of the crimes he was jailed for, which were producing and possessing child pornography and attacking some black teenagers. They were all against other teenagers, threatening his ex-girlfriend with a gun. They were all against other teenagers. And there's a real feeling to me that Mason is always perpetually 14 years old in his head. Mm-hmm. It's still this wild, like, fuck you, mom. I'm into Nazis and serial killers and like just this excitement by it. He claims he was going to go commit a school shooting when he was 16 and then instead went to the American Nazi Party headquarters in Alexandria, Virginia, and spent the next couple of years there until he was 18. And I just feel like in his head, he's still like 14 to 16. And that's how he talks to people. A lot of the people are attracted. A lot of these people in these neo-Nazi terrorist circles are very young. They're getting younger. I mean, they're so young. The founder of one of the groups of Feuer Creek Division was 12 years old when he founded it.
Yeah.
I mean, what's a group now? On the internet, you have a Telegram, you have private invites. I mean, like, but still, but this is not uncommon. We're seeing, especially in the European, where there's more referrals to anti-terrorism or preventative programs, that people are younger and younger and younger. It's like a big thing that people are 12, 13, 14 years old. And in a sense, to me, Mason's always talking, it's perfect for him because that's like the mindset that he's in. And that's who he, not entirely, but something appeals to. Now, some of the guys we talked about, and people like Rice and Parfrey, they were all in their 20s, right? This was an art project to them, right? Although there is, and you see this is actually interesting. If people read, Moynihan's famous for writing Lords of Chaos, the most important book about Norwegian black metal in English. It was really the first too. And in my work, watching his political evolution and reading Lords of Chaos and in it representing Varg Vikernes's evolution. He's the Nazi Satanist. He was a white supremacist black metal musician and recorded as Burzum, but started as a Nazi Satanist and ended as a heathen ethno-separatist. That Moynihan makes this move too. He hangs out with James Mason, and he's a Mason-style neo-Nazi who's a member of the Church of Satan, and he becomes not a white, no longer advocating a National Socialist super state, but wants a decentralized ethno-separatism, and he moves into heathenism quite proper. He's a serious heathen, a Sartre practitioner. And Varg makes the same change. And in fact, Varg even says, I think in Lords of Chaos or elsewhere, that this is a very typical change for black metal musicians to go from Nazi Satanism to heathen ethno-separatism. So I thought it was very interesting. And the book actually, if you read Lords of Chaos again, you can see he's almost advocating that transition. That's the sort of maturing for a certain group of people, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Just like skinheads move from oi music to like psychobilly or something, and then they move to Chicago.
Well, and Moynihan was interesting too, just as like a tiny sentence. It wasn't something he talks about, but he had like a fascination with blood.
Yeah,
perhaps some like dead body not necrophilia per se, but an interest in dead bodies. And for me, it's like, man, like what kink shaming was going on in the 80s and 90s, where like you probably couldn't be open about a lot of that stuff, and like what pipeline of kinksters who weren't allowed to be out existed there.
Well, I think a lot of this stuff had to do with HIV and AIDS, because in the 80s that was like, such an important thing. Like people don't, it's sort of like the Cold War. Like you read about it now, if you weren't like there, you cannot imagine like how all pervasive that was. We don't really talk about how much that affected people. And in the 80s, how much AIDS, which was a death sentence then, there was, before the cocktail, there was the drugs we have now are unthinkable. And, it's mostly a blood-borne, the easiest way to transmit it is through blood. And how much that was like on people's minds and front and center. So yeah, I'm sure. But then also like this stuff the blood stuff. Yes, he and Boyd Rice talk about blood a lot. And blood is like a thing for neo-Nazi style racists, the carrier of the of the race, right? The genetic carrier of the race. There's a lot of body modification and stuff starts then, and body self-mutilation. So like a lot of heroin is in these scenes. So people are using needles. People are starting to, in this extreme scene, the beginnings of what become the body modification and tattoos and stuff, which had in no way mainstream at that point, right? So there's a lot of this just sort of going around. I mean, it has an immediate resonance to things going on in society at the time. I think versus now we're a little more blasé about it. It just isn't so important culturally to us.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense. And even after you answered that, I was like, oh yeah. And also the racial component to blood makes like a ton of sense, but.
And that's it. Actually, this is like one of these weird, this is where, I spent too much of my life doing this stuff. You can tell what kind of a racist somebody is if they're really interested in blood, because there's an argument amongst neo-Nazis about whether race is biological or cultural, or what extent it's biological versus cultural. So if you're really into blood, you're on the biological side of that. Whereas someone like Julius Evola, who's a very well-known writer about spiritual issues and he was too far to the right for the Nazis. Says, oh, well, race can't all be blood. It's got to be mixed. It's got to be spiritual too, because otherwise any white person could be like a fascist. And of course, that's not true. There are all kinds of white people who really are Jews in their hearts or whatever, right? So it has to be more than just that, right? So there's these weird arguments. If you're really fixated on blood, you have a really like orthodox understanding of Nazi racial theories. So
yeah. This is where at some point my brain gets like exhausted by some of the stupidity of it, because so many of these thinkers, and I talked before I started recording about like Christian identity being one of those interest areas of mine, because people don't talk about it. But it's not based on anything. Like someone sat down, and because publishing was so limited, if they got their pamphlets out, the word spread, even if it was just thoughts they made up themselves.
Well, I mean, you're gonna. A lot of people will recoil when I say this, but like, is theology really based on any more?
Well, no, and that's where I find sort of like that overlap is very interesting, how the church gets a pass and then like a lot of these things are the worst of the worst, considered the extreme fringes of society.
There are a lot of what, especially these fringes, talk about. I say, like, read metaphorically. Like, what they're saying doesn't have any basis, but what are they're trying to get at, right? What are they? Um, what imperfect way are they talking about something? So I'm very interested in anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, which are of course false, and
Yep.
just do not control the world, and they're not behind the this and that. But I try to read them like, oh, this is a metaphor to complain about real problems in society, like that we have the sense, for example, of fragmentation in society, of a loss of control, that there's somewhere else that are people somewhere else who we can't quite see are directing our lives, that we're not in control of. And we really just can only follow things. There's a sense of helplessness, a sense of being aggrieved, but a sense of a loss of community, of like living in a fragmented world, and that this is being done to us, right? If you stop right there, that's a not incorrect, description of how people may feel in a society. And so, but then when you're like, oh, there's a Jewish conspiracy behind this, and they're doing it by pulling the strings, and like, that's all bullshit, right? But they're talking metaphorically. It's almost like if the Jews are a stand-in for like a hugely complicated social world, right? Like, yeah, the hugely complicated social world has produced this way of living, right? And then that, So when they talk about blood and these racial theories and stuff, sometimes I try to be like, well, let's read this as a metaphor, right? Like, it's kook science. And these guys love like getting into this is one of the weird obsessions with discredited sciences. And this was a link with Satanists. So social Darwinism, eugenics, very into eugenics and dysgenics, race science, this old race science stuff, right? And it was a weird kind of, a kind of a weird fascination with this. Anyway.
Yeah. Well, and the Darwin piece too, social Darwinism, like, is a bad reading of Darwin, because Darwin never says survival of the fittest. Darwin says survival of the most adaptable.
Right. Well, it's kind of Darwin's fault too, because at the end, as the social Darwinist rose, who's the main guy? Who's the main social Darwinist? I forget his name. Nature's tooth and claw friend. I mean, Darwin basically allowed him to be his representative, or to popularize this stuff without clashing. I mean, there's different periods of Darwin, right? He kind of goes back and forth about inherited characteristics at certain times, and like not quite sure some mechanisms. So, I mean, like any thinker over a long period of life, they have different things.
Right.
So, but yes, I mean, that's not the main thrust of Darwinism. I mean, and Darwin was never about, at the end of the day, Darwin is about species and not individual organisms, right? That's why it's species focus. It's why it's a group focused philosophy.
Yeah. Well, and I think that gets to too, like, the narrative of a lot of these things are not needing to be bogged down in facts and details. That's there for the people who are interested, but ultimately it's propaganda that's being put forth. And that's like, Might is Right is one of the books that pops up, or Might Makes Right. I'm mixing my titles up, but like, hey, here's this new vehicle that we can attach ourselves to for our propaganda to get it out to the masses.
Some of this stuff is just mood, I think. But I mean, you could put something out for mood, but then people do read it and take it seriously, right? Like, these guys weren't particularly intellectuals. I found out some of this stuff they would have quotes from these obscure thinkers. The obscure thinkers would end, almost inevitably be like some kind of like discredited race scientists, and then they just recycle the quote over and over in different publications over different years. So it's like, oh, you're not even reading this stuff, It's there to give you a panache of intellectualism.
Yeah, you talk about that in the book, and it reminded me of sort of like 4chan meme culture of like, oh, you're gonna quote a well-known thinker, and you're gonna put Pepe the Frog or whatever in your meme with it, but like, you've not read that. You haven't read that writer, that thinker, their other books, their criticisms. You're just grabbing this quote to give it some shine and make it seem legit, and then you're doing your 4chan memes with your other incel buddies.
I got asked if I wanted to write something about the influence of Mein Kampf on American white supremacists. So 100 years, Mein Kampf was published 100 years ago, which was interesting. I hadn't realized that in 1925. And I was like, no, I'm not. Because most of them haven't read it. Like it's a book that's talked about. And I read it last year, which first off, having done this work for 20 years, I only read Mein Kampf last year. That should be a symbol. And it's really boring. But a lot of it is about like the South Tyrol question, a German-speaking area of Italy, right? And like, what's the relationship between pan-Germanism, the folkish movement, and National Socialism? Like, this is not, but people are like, oh, this book, we all know what that book is. Every Nazi talks about it, but did they read it? No. I mean, I can't imagine. I had a hard time. I thought a lot of it was pretty boring. And if I can't power through a book like that, like forget that some Aryan Brotherhood guy is like going to be like, South Tyrol really should belong to Germany.
Did you read all of Siege? Like, did you read all of the publicated or the publication side of it?
So the book itself, the first edition is 450 pages. Each additional, there's 6 editions now, main ones in English, and they each get longer with more work in the appendices. Yes, I read it twice, and then it's the book it's actually an abridged anthology of the newsletters. There's 72 newsletters, and I read them all back to back.
Yeah.
I don't need to read that book anymore.
Well, and yeah, I think I'm one of those like nerdy types who will like, oh, let me go to the source material and read it because I'm curious. And like a lot of that stuff is, like you're saying, is very boring and dry. Reading some of the like early atheist thinkers, and like for me, I have this book on the historicity of Jesus, which was really instrumental when I left the church, like a scientific peer-reviewed journal on like, did Jesus exist or not? It's like 700 pages, and it is brutal to get through. Like, that's how my brain works. Like, I went to University of Minnesota. Like, I learned how to do good research. So like, I can do that. Yeah. But no one wants to pull that book off my bookshelf. I work with religious drama clients, and everyone's like, nah, I don't need the peer-reviewed journal. Thanks.
So there's the hashtag of the Nazis was Read Siege, which became very popular in 2007. 2018. So we tried to start a new hashtag for my book, which was Read About Siege.
Sure. Well, and yeah, I think a lot of people, I mean, I don't know. I don't have the research to back this up. I would need to talk to an internet researcher, but like, yeah, people didn't read Project 2025. I did. I study religious drama. I wanted to know what was going on, but like these people weren't reading it. It's boring, and it's not fun, and it's not smart, and there's just a lot of it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, also at some point, just about reading in your life, you can't read everything, and you don't. That's what I learned in grad school. Everything doesn't deserve to be sat down and read carefully. Like, you need to pick which things you do want to sit down and read carefully, because you can't read everything carefully. Like, which thinkers do you actually want to sit down with? Like, how much time do you actually want to spend on a book? Because I was always loath to like skim through stuff or not like sit down. And now I'm like, at some point you do realize, like, it's just, you have limited time. Like, what is it that you want to concentrate on? What do you want to half read? What do you want to fully read? What do you want to really like read a couple times, right? And that's a conscious choice you need to make. So, but that also you need to know that everyone doesn't. A lot of people will say they've read stuff they haven't. And even if they haven't read it, it doesn't mean that they weren't influenced by it.
Correct. Yeah.
Like, there is the Satanist current called Order of Nine Angles, who are a Nazi Satanist kind of thing. And they have produced thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of theology over the years, since the 70s. And there's like a whole thing now, people monitoring the far right. There's like a lot of academics now, which is a sort of new thing, who are becoming experts in O9A theology. Now, and they are, because O9A has influenced these neo-Nazi terrorists groups and people who are often very young. Now, these young people who are, for example, 14, 16 years old sometimes, some are older, they have not read thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of O9A theology, right. And they do not understand it all. And it doesn't matter, because they do, and they can, like everyone else, like communists, like Christians, like Nazis, understand the basic framework that comes out of it. You know what I mean? And that's what you need to know. It's interesting as an intellectual to read this stuff, to understand what the implications of the framework are that maybe you wouldn't see just because you hold it, or how it came to that, or what the, different things about it. But you don't need to have that sophisticated level of understanding of a doctrine to for it to be important. A Christian does not need to have read the Bible to understand what Christianity is to them. Usually it's what their church's interpretation, right? But you don't. You can point to the Bible, say, I believe in the Bible and the word of Jesus. God is in my heart. The God's word is represented through this specific representative, who has this lineage. And then we do prayer and acts, right? You don't fully legitimate, position to have. There's a whole history of why a person would say and believe these things in 2025. That believer does not need to know any of those things, does not need to have read the Bible, does not need to have to understand these splinters of their sect and how it got to that point to know the talking points, the theory, and the basic theory and praxis, and that's all they need to know. So
and I would generally say, even when I was a Christian, that most Christians haven't read the Bible, and that's pretty well established. But I think it helps for people who can look at something like neo-Nazism and be like, oh, well, this is very intellectually dishonest. Like, right, Atomwaffen would have known James Mason was in jail for inappropriate things with minors, and like not a deal breaker for them, right? And and so when people want to say, hey, how could Christians vote for?
Perhaps a selling point for them.
Well, and rape waffen's a whole separate offshoot of Atomwaffen. But the people who want to say, how did Christians vote for Donald Trump? Well, same thing. Not some of these things just weren't a deal breaker for them. They like the dog whistles that they hear, and that's enough for them to go on.
Yeah. Well, my favorite thing, it was very early on. I worked with a think tank called Political Research Associates. It still exists. They have a lot of former fundy kids like you, people who grew up fundamentalist Christian. Many as they got older left Christianity and a lot of them were queer. Not here nor there. That was a big part of the scene. And a lot of them retained a lifelong interest in Christian theology. Some of them went to seminary. And so very early on, they were like, wait a minute, Trump is courting fundamentalist Christians, evangelicals, right? And I was like, very early on, like, oh, that was a really weird move. There was like one of the first things he talks, this is, I remember from people in this think tank, wrote about, he spoke to some gathering of church leaders, and he had like this Bible, like a brand new Bible with like a piece of paper and a big red arrow in it, and he's like waving it like, this is it, this is the thing, like totally ridiculous. And they're like, this is never gonna fly. But that these leaders, Protestants all, I'm sure, went back and had these political discussions, because the Christian right is a very, like Lenin, it's very cadre driven, very like well organized, goal oriented, ends justify the means movement. And they came back and they told their people about the criticisms to their base that the beautiful phrase that he's an imperfect vessel.
Yeah. And
I was just like, that is so good. So they do know. It's not even a selling point. They're just like, we don't care. Like this.
Well, and that's.
And so many people on the right, they see the same thing in Trump. They're like, many, like they're all of the Republican Party, all of the elected officials. These people aren't stupid people who are senators, who spent their life in politics, who were neocons back in the day, like they're not stupid about what Trump is doing. They're acting in lockstep with him. They will not vote against him. He is just a vehicle for enough of their politics that they're going to stay on that.
Yeah.
Stay on the Trump train.
That's an old church tactic. I mean, that's what the Catholic Church used for the abuse scandal. That's what Hillsong, the big mega church that had a pastor who was abusing people, is going to trot out, that like humans are flawed and God uses them anyway. So it is fascinating to see some of those ideologies, with the Satanist group. I'm not well versed on Order of Nine angles other than just reading up on some of the extremism, but like they're pro like child porn. So that just seems like a bright flashing light for pedophiles to find community.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, they're so extreme that they have explicit part of their theological doctrine is called culling, which is basically just murdering people.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they're like it's interesting. I saw some of the reviews of as they come out of Britain in the 70s, but are still around. In the 80s, as the stuff reaches the United States in the Church of Satan periodical, they had an internal periodical called the Black Flame. They're talking about 098, and this is in the middle of the Satanic Panic, and they're like, well, this stuff is like exactly what Christians claim about Satanists, right? There are these people who are Satanists. They're worshiping a literal Satan. They think there's an anthropomorphic deity or some kind of other like deity that you should like commit, heretical acts, which explicitly include murdering people. Like this is what the stereotype is. So, which it is.
Yeah. It's fascinating. Spencer, I want to be respectful of your time, and I'm so glad you're taking the time to chat. We talked a little bit before I got you on the podcast that this work it's sort of work to you. It sounds like it's not a huge hit on your mental health to be reading neo-Nazi pamphlets from the 80s and 90s. So I'm going to tweak the question a little bit just to say, like, what do you sort of find as grounding, as stuff, if this isn't necessarily a bother to your mental health, just still sort of how do you navigate studying neo-Nazism and the rise of the religious right happening in real time and fascism taking over? Like, what do you sort of do to take care of yourself existing in the world as it is today?
Yeah, I would think about this a bit more. We had this conversation. A lot of people are traumatized by doing this work. And it is a real live question about that kind of self-care and trauma. Some people even who do this who aren't, I think, don't have a very rigorous political background, have been known to go over and become indoctrinated to the other side. Yep. I think this is a real problem, I think, with people doing trust and safety at social media, because you just get everyday people who don't. It's our take that if you don't already have your kind of politics set up going into it and know what you believe in, you're very liable to be influenced by things. If you have a better political understanding, you understand, like, no, they're wrong because of this is what they're doing, right? Which is different than just emotionally being appealed to stuff. If you're bombarded by the propaganda, you may become, seduced by it as well. That does happen. So other people can be really traumatized by this work. I don't feel like I am. History is easier. People talking about these things 40 years ago on pieces of paper is quite different than someone like able right now to talk about something immediately this minute, and they really can get you. They really can stick it in where it really has that force of impact of something you hadn't seen before. And that, so it's easier in the past. I think, but I did have to think about this. I get asked this a lot. Like, I don't think it's value added emotionally. I think at the end of the day, it doesn't bother me. I don't think about, to me, it's like, oh, I got to do work. Okay. They're intellectual questions that would be the same as any other intellectual questions that I like rattle around my brain during the day. But like, it can't be value added, right? This can't be like, oh, I feel like this is just a wholesome thing. I'm really being concerned about the world. I mean, some people do like that. They see me as like a defender of certain communities or something. That does happen, and that's nice. But yeah, I don't know. I think like anyone else, gardening. Gardening's good. Music. Yeah. I try to make art, but I feel actually I don't know, maybe it's an age thing. Like after I'm done working, like I don't want to sit down and it's almost more work to make art, so I don't.
Yeah.
Yeah. I would like to think in my brain than I do. Cocktails. I like cocktails.
Sure. Is music like a safe haven, or have you sort of had to like move away from some of the like, oh, that might be a little too adjacent to what I study?
No. I mean, I'm not interested in the. I did go to a show. No, because the stuff I like they're not really around that. I mean, it was really an 80s thing that was a big center of this stuff. I mean, there are still black metal bands in particular. There's a problem there. If you were going to find a Nazi skinhead band at this point in the game, if
they're not good music.
Could find one, like the fact that you would be able to find them in and of itself shows that you're in some other place where you shouldn't be.
Yeah. There's a 1993 documentary on, again, one of the streaming services I don't remember, about Nazi skinhead punk music, and like it's not very good. It's not very listenable.
Well, I mean, there's a reason people know Screwdriver, because they're one of the only bands that can play. Like them and No Remorse, and the rest of them, Ixnay. I mean, they're all terrible. I think they're all terrible. Even in the punk scene, there are certainly right-wing punks, but they tend to be about Trumpist.
Yeah.
This is a big fight amongst punks. remaining punks about the increasing Trumpist cohort, but they're not neo-Nazis. So I don't know, watching like Desert Blues, Sub-Saharan African bands playing Desert Blues, not a whole bunch of Nazis there. I like a lot of weird, quirky stuff. So it tends to be more free of these problems than other things. I mean, I did go to I won't go see a neo-folk band unless they explicitly say that they are anti-fascist.
Yeah.
Although I did end up at a show last year, and there was the girlfriend of someone who had been a fascist neo-folk musician there, who supposedly had left the scene, left white supremacist politics without, which I would take with 23 grains of salt. But yes, I was not happy to be there with her. Like, my friends were talking and they introduced me to her, and I was like, fuck, I don't want to like cause a big scene. She's not him, and he supposedly left, but I don't want to be at a neo-folk scene with the like partner of a famous fascist neo-folk musician. So even though the band themselves were explicitly anti-fascist, like, that's when you'll get in trouble. I think that and black metal shows are the big places now, or anywhere. Yeah, I mean, it's the Viking metal, of course. Tread carefully.
Yeah, for sure. And I think this is a separate topic too, but I'm trying to wrap things up. But like, I think groups policing themselves, like, I'm a pro wrestling fan, which has its own countercultural history, and like going to a show where someone says something shitty to one of the female wrestlers, and then the fans like point at them and get them kicked out. Like, those things matter. That's important.
Absolutely. You want to create an atmosphere of that. You want to create an inclusive atmosphere with clearly defined limits, with plenty of room for difference and argument. It doesn't have to be a liberal thing, but there has to be a clearly defined limit. And some of that has to be a sense of we're all in it together. And if what you're saying is going to exclude people here on the basis of like kinds of things, you're not in it together with us.
Yeah, and I've seen that at some of the metal or some of the like folk metal, pagan-y type metal bands too, where it's like, there's a policing of their own that goes on because they don't want the association, and I think that matters.
It's good. It is an important thing to do.
Spencer, if people want to read the book, which we talked about some boring writers, I didn't have any problem getting through the book. Like, I was I've read the Bible multiple times. I was that type of Christian, and there's boring parts of it, but like, of the Bible, not your book. I was concerned we might get lost. I was concerned with your charts at the beginning, like, oh no, there's too many acronyms. But it was very easy to track, and I think what I liked in going back to it is each chapter is sort of standalone, so you can sort of go topically. With some of the figures I was very familiar with, I didn't need to go back, and like someone like Moynihan, I had no frame of reference for until I had read your book. So it's, but I thought it was really good and very readable. If people want to pick it up, if people want to follow more of your work, where do they go? How do they find you?
Sure. So one of the things about it has 30 chapters, and as you've said, they can be self-contained. Is that this allowed people to pick it up and put it down more easily, they could read a part without having to follow the whole narrative. And then it'd be like reading a whole separate thing individually later, which I thought was kind of interesting. The book is called Neo-Nazi Terrorism and Countercultural Fascism, The Origins and Afterlife of James Mason's Siege. Came out last year on Routledge. You can buy it through their website. They often have sales on it. You can buy it through Bezos if you need to. I'm on all the social medias, most active on Blue Sky right now. My website is spencersunshine.com. I have links there to about 150 articles I've written over since the aughts, if you want almost all for free. There are organizing guides I've written, like you may want to check out 40 Ways to Fight Fascists, Street Legal Tactics for Community Activists. It's it is what it does, what it says on the tin. It's my very nuts and bolts guide to how to counter-organize against white supremacists and violent far-right elements. A third edition hopefully will be coming out within the next year on Microcosm. It's available in several languages and stuff. The whole thing is available for free on my website. And I encourage people to support me on Patreon if you're interested in what I've been saying and doing. I am not funded. I don't work with a think tank anymore, at least. I don't have a university position. Nobody supports me. I'm a freelancer. I mean, people on my Patreon support me, and you could be one of them. So for $2 or more a month, you can get free exclusive content and a warm, fuzzy feeling for supporting anti-fascist research. And so, and also I'm just saying, because social media just comes and goes, and there's so many waves of stuff. Is that I'm encouraging people to, you can sign up for free for Patreon for a week to check out the content, but you can just sign up for free to follow somebody. And then you just get the public posts. And I'm encouraging people to sign up if you're interested in what I'm doing, just to get not any of the money content stuff, but just public things being posted that then you will get email notifications about. And there I'll put things about major articles and books and talks and stuff. I just completed a 24-date speaking tour in the last year. So then people are like, oh, you just spoke in my town last week. I didn't know. And I'm like, I can't tell you if you don't follow closely. You know, so that's where you can find me. If you have questions, you're welcome to come, and I'm happy to talk to you about any of the elements in here if you want to know further about these things.
Yeah, and I think your website is also very user-friendly in finding some of those older interviews, maybe for people who want more of the take on some of the music stuff or on some of the specifics that you and I didn't get into the nitty-gritty of. But again, a lot of that stuff is on your website, and we will have links to all those things in the show notes so people can just click over there if they're interested. Spencer, thanks so much for writing the book. I think it's something that gets overlooked and so like very needed in our current conversations around the alt-right. But thanks for taking the time to come on the podcast and chat today.
Oh, thanks for having me here. I'm gonna use something you said. Spencer's book, quote, less boring than the Bible.
Yes, it was a much easier read than the Bible, much more interesting. All right,
put me on.
And to all the wonderful listeners tuning in, thanks so much for joining us. We'll be back next week with another new episode. Take care, everyone.